His 3-year-old son vanished right in front of their home. In just a fleeting moment, while the father turned to chat with his neighbor, the little boy suddenly disappeared without leaving a single trace. What should have been an ordinary, harmless moment became a memory that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 14 years later, on a heavy afternoon, Evan Blake happened to come across an old missing poster tacked to a utility pole, and what he saw there made his heart stop. The words, "Missing in Crestwood, Oregon," stood out beneath the faded photograph of a 3-year-old boy. In that instant, the painful past rushed back, blending with the long screech of a train pulling into the station. Evan Blake had always believed his life was built on simple, solid ground. Crestwood, Oregon was not a place people associated with danger or mystery. It was the kind of quiet town where neighbors waved to each other across freshly mowed lawns, where the evenings smelled faintly of pine and barbecues, and where children rode their bikes up and down the same streets their parents had once played on. Evan, now 38, remembered those years with a bittersweet ache, the years before everything was torn apart by a single afternoon. Back then, he was in his mid-20s, recently married, and adjusting to the joys and struggles of fatherhood. His son, Daniel, was just 3 years old, a bundle of restless energy, with wide eyes that never seemed to stop asking questions. Daniel had inherited his mother's light hair and Evan's sharp curiosity, a child who loved chasing the family's old golden retriever across the yard and begging for one more story before bedtime. For Evan, fatherhood had felt like stepping into a brand new world, one filled with laughter, exhaustion, and hope. The Blakes' home stood on the corner of Willow Street, a modest 2-story house with peeling paint and a garden Evan never seemed to have enough time to maintain. But to the young family, it was more than enough. Inside those walls, evenings were filled with the clatter of toys on the hardwood floor, the smell of dinners hastily prepared after work, and the gentle rhythm of life that seemed, at the time, unshakable. Their neighbors were friendly, the kind of people who borrowed sugar and left homemade pies on doorsteps. It was this sense of security that lulled Evan into believing his son was safe, even when he wasn't directly in his sight. After all, Crestwood was a town where children roamed freely from porch to porch, and where every adult was assumed to be trustworthy. But beneath that warm familiarity, Evan carried the quiet weight of responsibility. His wife often reminded him that Daniel was still just a toddler, prone to wandering off without a second thought. He needed constant watching, constant protecting. On that fateful day, Evan had been distracted, engaged in a casual conversation with his neighbor, the kind of harmless exchange that should have lasted no more than a few minutes. He could still recall the sound of laughter, the warm sun on his shoulders, and the easy comfort of talking about nothing important at all. And then Daniel was gone. In the years since, Evan's memories of that time had become fractured, like old film reels flickering in the dark. Some moments remained sharp, the sound of Daniel's giggle, the way he tugged on Evan's sleeve when he wanted attention, the sight of his small shoes lined neatly by the door. Other memories blurred together, washed out by grief and regret. Crestwood itself had changed little over the years, but to Evan, it had become a town haunted by absence. Every street corner, every front yard, seemed to echo with what had been lost. For the Blake family, life had been divided into two halves, the time before Daniel's disappearance and the long, aching years that followed. That afternoon had begun like countless others in Crestwood, bathed in golden light and the easy rhythm of suburban life. The sun was sinking gently, casting long shadows across Willow Street. Neighbors tended to their lawns, children chased one another in games of tag, and Evan Blake stepped outside with Daniel by his side. It was the kind of moment that should have faded into memory as nothing more than an ordinary summer day. Evan spotted his neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, standing by the fence that separated their yards. The older man was always eager for conversation, and Evan, still holding Daniel's small hand, paused to exchange a few words. The topics were harmless: the weather, the new grocery store opening in town, the usual flow of neighborhood chatter. Daniel, restless as always, tugged at his father's fingers, eager to break free and dart toward the patch of grass where the dog usually played. Evan hesitated for only a second. He loosened his grip, allowing Daniel to wander a few steps away. After all, the yard was enclosed, the street was quiet, and what harm could come in the short span of a casual chat? He kept half an eye on his son, watching the little boy stoop to pick up a toy truck left near the porch. But as the conversation deepened, Evan's attention drifted. Minutes slipped away, the kind of minutes that seem inconsequential until they define the rest of a life. He laughed at something Mr. Hargrove said, glanced toward the setting sun, and thought vaguely about the chores waiting inside. When he finally turned back toward the yard, his laughter caught in his throat. Daniel was gone. At first, it didn't register as panic. Children were quick, after all, and Daniel loved to hide. Evan called his son's name, expecting a giggle in response. A small figure darting out from behind the wand hedge, or crouching beneath the porch steps. Silence answered him. He called again, louder this time, scanning the yard. Still, nothing. The unease grew sharp, clawing at the back of his throat. He dropped the conversation mid-sentence and hurried across the grass, checking the corners of the yard, the side of the house, even the spot where Daniel often crouched to watch ants crawl in the dirt. Empty. His voice rose, now edged with fear, echoing down the quiet street. Daniel. Neighbors began to notice. Doors opened. Curious faces peered out. Someone asked what was wrong, and Evan's words tumbled out in fragments. My son, he was just here, he's gone. Within moments, the calm suburban evening fractured into chaos. People spread out in different directions, calling the child's name, searching hedges, porches, and backyards. Evan's heart pounded with a sickening rhythm. He ran into the house, certain his son had slipped inside without him noticing, but every room stood empty. Toys lay untouched. The dog wagged its tail in confusion, and the silence pressed in heavier with every second. When he stepped back onto the porch, the street was no longer serene. A handful of neighbors were combing the sidewalks, some shouting Daniel's name into the still air. Evan's wife emerged from the kitchen, her face blanching as she read the terror in her husband's eyes. "Where's Daniel?" she demanded. And Evan had no answer. In less than 5 minutes, the world had changed. The ordinary calm of Crestwood dissolved into fear, and Evan Blake stood at the center of it all, his heart cracking under the weight of a realization he could not yet bear to name. His son had vanished. The first few minutes after Daniel's disappearance blurred into frantic motion. Evan's voice cracked as he shouted his son's name again and again, each call growing sharper, more desperate. The neighbors who had once lounged on porches or watered gardens now moved with urgency, fanning out along Willow Street, searching bushes, peering behind fences, and checking driveways. At first, the search carried an undercurrent of hope. Children sometimes wandered after all. Perhaps Daniel had simply toddled down the street, chasing a butterfly or a stray cat. Perhaps he had ducked into a neighbor's yard without notice. People reassured Evan with words he could hardly hear. "We'll find him. He's probably hiding. Kids do this all the time." But as minutes stretched into a half hour, the sense of unease hardened into something darker. Evan's wife clutched the porch railing, her face drained of color, while Evan himself stumbled from yard to yard, his voice raw, refusing to stop calling for Daniel. The golden retriever barked wildly, tugging at its chain, as though sensing the chaos its owners could not comprehend. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, someone had already dialed 911. The first patrol car pulled onto Willow Street, its flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in red and blue. An officer stepped out, calm but firm, notebook in hand, and began asking questions. When was the boy last seen? What was he wearing? Which direction might he have gone? Evan's answers came in broken fragments, tangled by guilt and panic. He was right here. I only looked away for a moment. He was wearing blue shirt, little sneakers. He was just here. Soon more officers arrived. They established a perimeter, moving quickly from house to house, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors. Volunteers formed search lines, combing every yard and alleyway. Flashlights cut through the growing darkness as they scoured ditches, playgrounds, and the wooded lot at the end of the street. The town's ordinary sounds, crickets, the distant hum of traffic, were drowned out by the chorus of voices calling one name, Daniel. Evan tried to follow, tried to help, but an officer gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay here," he said firmly. "We need you close in case he comes back." The words struck him like a blow. In case he comes back, as though his son had slipped into some hidden place beyond their reach. Helicopters soon thumped overhead, their searchlights sweeping across rooftops and tree lines. K-9 units were brought in, dogs straining against their leashes as they sniffed for the boy's scent. At one point, a handler reported the dogs had caught a faint trail leading toward the edge of Crestwood, near the small patch of forest that bordered the town. Officers surged in that direction, and for a brief moment, hope surged in Evan's chest. But the trail ended abruptly at the roadside. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a small child pushing through the brush. It was as if the scent had simply vanished into thin air. By midnight, the neighborhood had transformed into something unrecognizable. Search parties moved with grim determination, their voices hoarse from hours of calling. Neighbors who had once been friendly faces now looked pale, frightened, whispering theories that made Evan's stomach turn. Maybe someone took him. Maybe a car. A few people remembered seeing a vehicle earlier in the evening, parked near the corner of Willow Street, a dark sedan with tinted windows. Nobody had noticed it leave, but nobody had seen it stay either. The police jotted it down, their expressions tightening. Back at the house, Evan's wife sat on the porch steps, rocking back and forth, whispering their son's name as though prayer might conjure him back. Evan stood beside her, numb, his mind replaying the same unbearable moment, the instant he loosened his grip on Daniel's small hand. That tiny act, so ordinary, so innocent, had shattered their world. The search continued deep into the night, but as the hours dragged on, an unspoken truth began to settle over Crestwood. Children do not simply vanish without a sound, without a trace, without a reason. Something had happened to Daniel Blake, and whatever it was far more terrifying than anyone had dared imagine. And for Evan, standing helpless in the glow of police lights and neighbors' flashlights, one thought consumed him. He had been there, only a few feet away, and still his son was gone. The first 48 hours were a blur of police reports, neighborhood sweeps, and endless questions that Evan struggled to answer. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face, heard his laugh, felt the small tug of his hand slipping from his own. But as the hours dragged into days, the case began to shift. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing child was now leaning toward a far darker possibility: abduction. It was the neighbors who first mentioned the car. Several recalled seeing a dark sedan parked at the corner of Willow Street in the days leading up to Daniel's disappearance. At first, no one thought much of it. Crestwood wasn't the sort of town where strangers stood out. But on that particular afternoon, more than one person had noticed the vehicle lingering near the intersection. Some said the engine was running, others claimed it left in a hurry not long after Daniel vanished. When police pressed for details, the answers blurred together. Was it black or dark blue? Were the windows tinted, or was the glare of the sun just playing tricks? The one thing they agreed on: they hadn't seen it before. Investigators canvassed the area, searching for security cameras that might have captured the vehicle. But Crestwood was not a city of surveillance. Most homes were older, without modern systems, and the few cameras at local businesses offered only grainy, inconclusive footage. A shape of a car appeared briefly on one tape, but it was impossible to make out a license plate. Suspicion also crept closer to home. Detectives interviewed every neighbor, some more than once. The Hargroves, the elderly couple next door, seemed cooperative, though shaken by the knowledge that a child had vanished while speaking to them. Yet whispers soon circulated. Why had no one seen Mrs. Hargrove outside that evening, when she was usually in the garden? Why had Mr. Hargrove seemed so distracted during his conversation with Evan, constantly glancing toward the street? Theories multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. One young woman down the street claimed she saw a man she didn't recognize walking near the wooded lot just before sunset. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, carrying what looked like a backpack. At the time, she thought nothing of it. People often cut through the lot as a shortcut to the highway, but in hindsight, the image gnawed at her. Police searched the woods extensively, but aside from broken branches and scattered footprints, there was nothing that could be tied conclusively to Daniel. Even those closest to the Blake family were not immune to scrutiny. Detectives gently probed Evan himself, asking about arguments at home, financial troubles, whether anyone might have reason to harm the family. Each question felt like an accusation, like salt ground into a wound. Evan answered through clenched teeth, his grief boiling into anger. How could they think for even a moment that he would harm his own son? Yet he also knew, in cases like this, suspicion spared no one. The investigation reached outward, pulling in strangers who had passed through Crestwood in recent weeks, a door-to-door salesman who had made calls in the area, a handyman who'd been spotted working on a nearby roof, even a delivery driver whose route included Willow Street. Each person was tracked down, questioned, scrutinized. Each lead ended the same way. Nothing solid, nothing certain. But the most chilling clue emerged from a child's perspective. A boy from 2 houses down told investigators he'd seen Daniel standing near the curb looking at something. When asked what, the boy hesitated, then whispered, "A man was waving at him from a car." The description was vague, a man with dark hair, maybe wearing glasses. But it was enough to confirm what many had already begun to fear. Daniel had not simply wandered off. He had been lured. This possibility split the community in two. Some clung to hope that Daniel was still alive, that he might be found if they just looked harder, searched farther. Others whispered that too much time had passed, that whatever had happened on Willow Street had taken the boy far beyond Crestwood's borders. For Evan, each lead felt like a cruel tease, a thread that unraveled before it could be grasped. He replayed every second of that afternoon, searching for details he might have missed. Had he seen the car? Had he noticed someone watching? The memory twisted, blurred by guilt, until he no longer trusted his own recollection. Police promised they would not give up, but as days turned into weeks, the trail grew colder. The car had vanished. The man in the baseball cap was never identified. The neighbors' suspicions dissolved into rumors, then silence. What remained was a void, a child gone without a trace, and a father left with nothing but unanswered questions and the gnawing certainty that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened. The days that followed Daniel's disappearance stretched into an endless blur of exhaustion, grief, and desperate hope. For Evan and his wife, time no longer moved. In hours or minutes, it moved in frantic searches, in police updates, in the quiet collapse that came each night when there was still no word of their son. Evan barely ate. He walked the streets until his legs ached, calling Daniel's name into the silence, long after search parties had returned home. His wife remained glued to the porch, staring down Willow Street, as if willing her son to come bounding back at any moment. Neighbors came with casseroles, with candles, with awkward words of comfort that dissolved into silence when they realized there was nothing to say. The once bustling neighborhood now felt like a stage set for grief, every corner heavy with what was missing. Flyers bearing Daniel's face appeared on telephone poles, in grocery stores, at gas stations across Oregon. His wide eyes and innocent smile stared back at strangers from rest stop bulletin boards and convenience store windows. The family organized vigils, holding candles that flickered in the night while prayers rose into the still air. Reporters came, cameras flashing, asking Evan questions he could barely answer. Do you believe he's still alive? Do you have faith he'll come home? His throat tightened around every word, his answers choked by the weight of uncertainty. Weeks turned into months. The police investigation slowed, though they assured the Blakes they were still pursuing leads. Tips trickled in a sighting of a boy at a truck stop, a neighbor claiming to hear a child crying in the woods, but each lead ended in disappointment. Every false alarm tore at the fragile fabric of the Blakes' hope. Evan's wife began to crumble under the weight of it all, her once bright energy drained into hollow silence. At night, She clutched Daniel's favorite blanket, whispering his name into the darkness, refusing to let go of the small comfort it provided. Evan's grief turned inward, hardening into guilt. He replayed the moment over and over, the way he had loosened his grip, the way his attention had drifted. That single choice haunted him like a curse. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, consumed instead by the mission of finding his son. He scoured online forums, studied missing child cases, and drove for hours chasing rumors that never panned out. Friends urged him to rest, to heal, but he could not. "How do you rest?" he asked bitterly, "when your child is out there somewhere, calling for you?" The years that followed did not dull the ache. Anniversaries came and went, each one marked by vigils and news reports that spoke of Daniel in the past tense. Birthdays passed with empty chairs at the table. Evan's wife grew quieter, retreating into her grief, while Evan grew more restless, determined never to stop searching no matter how many doors slammed in his face. Their marriage strained under the weight of absence. Yet they clung to one another, bound by the same loss. Crestwood, once a place of innocence, became a town shadowed by memory. Children still played in yards, but parents watched more closely now, their laughter tinged with unease. For Evan, every child's cry, every flash of blonde hair in a crowd, every glimpse of a boy around Daniel's age, sent his heart racing, only to shatter when he realized it wasn't him. The pain of not knowing became its own prison. To lose a child was unbearable, but to lose one without answers was torture. 14 years later, the questions still lingered, sharp and relentless. Where had Daniel gone? Who had taken him? And why had the world remained silent in the face of a father's endless cries? 14 years after that morning on Willow Street, Daniel's disappearance remained an open wound in Crestwood, a mystery without an answer, a question that haunted every corner of the town. The posters had long since faded, the search parties disbanded, and yet the story refused to let go. His name lingered in hushed conversations, in the cautious glances of neighbors who still remembered the boy with the bright smile who vanished into thin air. For the Blake family, time had not healed. It had only stretched the silence wider. Every year brought the same unanswered prayers, the same ache that gnawed at the heart. Investigators moved on to other cases, and yet no definitive lead ever surfaced. No fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no confession. It was as if Daniel had been swallowed by the earth itself. Rumors continued to swirl. Some believed he had been taken by a passing drifter. Others whispered of organized trafficking rings. There were even those who speculated about darker, unexplainable forces in the woods around Crestwood, tales locals shared in quiet voices when the night grew heavy. But speculation never brought answers, and it never brought Daniel home. Evan, now older and worn by years of searching, still refused to surrender. His house was lined with boxes of files, newspaper clippings, and maps marked with pins, his private shrine to a search that had never ended. "As long as I breathe," he told anyone who asked, "I'll keep looking. My boy is out there somewhere." His words carried both hope and heartbreak, a father trapped between faith and despair. The truth remained just out of reach, locked away by time and silence. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of such mysteries, not only the loss itself, but the absence of closure. A door left forever ajar, a story without an ending. To this day, Daniel Blake's disappearance stands as one of Crestwood's most chilling unsolved cases. No matter how many years pass, the question echoes: how does a child vanish on a quiet neighborhood street, under the eyes of his father, and leave behind nothing but a shadow? If you found this story haunting, don't forget to support Last Seen by subscribing and turning on notifications. Here, we uncover the mysteries of those who vanished, stories that should never be forgotten.